everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Cup Reviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I am your host and marketing manager, Mackenzie, and today we are following up our last week's episode with Angels in America Part 2, Perestroika. And joining me, we got some new faces, we got some familiar faces, and we all got cups. So, first off, one of our new faces we have is Dana. Hello, Dana.
Hello.
Hello. So, Dana, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us what's in your cup today.
Okay. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Alberta, out here in Western Canada, and in the drama department. And in my cup is some chamomile tea with honey. Just needing a little soothing of the throat today.
Wonderful. And we also have a new face to us, Cal. Hello, Cal.
Hi, I'm Cal Mcdonald. I'm a master's student in my second year at the University of Ottawa, and I'm studying memory and trauma. And in my cup today is just water.
Love it.
I wish I could have bluffed and said this was just straight vodka or something.
You still can.
We can always edit around that if you want that to be your answer.
Yeah.
And of course, we have one of the most familiar faces on the Cup Reviews, Ryan, the co-producer of All Things the Cup, the literary manager, resident dramaturg. Hello, Ryan. What is your ensemble? And what is in your cup?
I'm wearing a shirt. Thanks for asking. Hello, I'm Ryan. I guess if we're all talking about our graduate affiliations, I am a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and I am drinking orange pico tea out of the cup. So thanks for having me.
Oh, anytime. And I am not a graduate student, so I'm not part of this academic club, but that's okay. I still get to drink out of the cup with an Earl Grey tea.
You guys really start the product placement strong.
Yes.
We try.
Our merch is not yet for sale, but we do have it. It exists.
It does exist. If you do want us to start some merch, let us know. If you really be interested in getting your own cup. Yeah, comment down below. Well, so why don't we get into this piece, which was directed by Marianne Elliott and starred Nathan Lane and Andrew Garfield in the title roles.
Title roles?
Yeah, Roy Cohn and Pryor, the big names of the show.
Okay, I don't think that's what title role means, but go on.
All right.
Someone who plays the angel. Anyway, off to a great start. Keep going.
We are off to a great start. We're keeping it light, considering this is a very dark play. So, Cal, why don't you start us off with what character or track do you think was best performed in this production?
I think that Nathan Stewart Jarrett was the best in terms of range compared to performances I've seen him give before. He really stood out as having such a depth to Belize and such a handle on the character. In Perestroika, we mostly got him as Belize. Like, he only shows up as Harper's guide for one or two scenes, but I still think, best overall.
Yeah. He's very brief in his appearance. Actually, I have a fun note because we will be talking about the character Belize later, and it really comes back to this wonderful performance we got. That's great. Dana, who is your shout out of this particular production?
I loved Belize as well, but I wanted to give a specific shout out to Susan Brown, who plays the Hannah, mainly Hannah, but she also plays Ethel Rosenberg. She plays the oldest living Bolshevik, and of course one of the angels. They all play one of the angels later. But I thought she was really fantastic with the kind of range that you need for that track. You know, playing all of these characters who kind of stand in for the old world, they stand in for the past, and only Hannah really comes through that threshold of revelation, if you will, and manages to change. And I think the scene I was most moved by in the whole production was was seeing her and Pryor in the hospital room when they decide that they're not going to make assumptions about each other's characters. And then she, she tells him, don't assume that you know what I think or what I feel. And he has that very funny line about, I wish you were truer to your demographic profile. But it's this really extraordinary moment. And when she reassures him after he shows his lesions, on his chest, and she says it's a cancer, nothing more human than that. And it's really, such an extraordinary moment. I thought it was, really was one of the best moments in the whole production.
Mm-hmm. I will piggyback off that because I also had, Susan, Hannah.
Susan Brown.
Susan Brown as Hannah,
Susan Brown as Hannah Pitt, and also Ethel Rosenberg.
Yeah.
With her other really big role, in part 2. But, last episode I was on, I gave a shout out to Nathan Lane. And I didn't just want to do another Nathan Lane shout out because while he was wonderful in part 2 and I wanted to see more of him in this part, I do have to give it, to Susan Brown because throughout part 1 and part 2, she has done such a great job being a chameleon and morphing between all these different characters, whether it's the rabbi, Hannah, Ethel, and all the other characters, Dana, that you pointed out. Like, she was able to differentiate them so well that each one of them have their own posture, their own walk, distinct vocal pattern, and mannerisms. They all felt individual, and whether they had a one-track scene or like Hannah's character, which was part 1 and part 2, a very large journey this character had to go on, she was able to articulate those journeys so well, and you could see the metamorphing of these characters and the changes each of them go through as they go on their own journeys. That hospital scene was so powerful because of how human she made Hannah. And it was really an example of what we really need in the world today. This empathetic ability to talk to one another. You may not be on the same side of the aisle, you may not agree on anything, but the fact that you're able to come to a conversation, by the end, you are able to kind of put aside your assumptions, and be able to talk openly with each other. I thought that was a beautiful scene.
I think that scene's also a great parallel with, Ethel showing up to be like, I'm gonna spit on your grave.
Yes.
And then, like finding it in her to sing for Roy. Like, that is one of the best moments of the play for me.
It is. And I mean, anybody who has to kind of stand up against Nathan Lane in the scene, who by his own nature is a scene stealer, even when he is a cartoon meerkat, he is able to steal the spotlight from other people. So the fact that she was able to hold her own and make these two foils of a character for Nathan, the comedic, it was funny almost, their battles with each other. It was like such old Jewish humor style verbal dueling that they do. It was just wonderful and sad to watch at the same time. But it was great. So yeah, Susan Brown as Hannah Pitt and Ethel Rosenberg was just fantastic. I was thoroughly enjoyed her in part 1 and also particularly in part 2 as well. She had some great character scenes in here that really have beautiful journeys to watch. Ryan, who was your shout out?
Well, if none of you are going to say it, I will. Nathan Lane is my shout out because,
yes, there he is.
I wasn't on the part 1 episode, so I don't feel like I'd just be doubling down on that. Obviously, I agree with the shout outs that you've all made so far because this is a really great, strong cast overall. I will say for the most part, but we'll talk later. Nathan Lane I think steals this show, both parts of it. He is. I love Al Pacino as much as the next guy, but to me, Nathan Lane is now the definitive Roy Cohn. I don't think I will be able to reread the play without picturing Nathan Lane just in this role. I think he kind of just becomes the character so well. And there's a lot of, he has a lot of star power. He's very recognizable, his face, his voice. And, you don't forget that it's Nathan Lane when you're watching it, and true to the Brechtian spirit of this piece, I don't think you're supposed to. But I just think, yeah, he immerses himself in this character so well, and Perestroika puts him through the ringer. We definitely get to see the full gamut of his range in this piece.
This is a much more nuanced Nathan Lane. And the last Nathan Lane was very much angry Max Bialystock, a lot in part 1. Because part 2 was a lot of time of him in the hospital bed, it was a much more subtle, aggressive nature to this character. It actually reminded me a lot of his performance as F. Lee Bailey when he did The People vs. O.J. and had to play another really despicable lawyer who really
he's good
pushes
at playing
the envelope.
Despicable lawyers. It's maybe
and
it's a
you know what
special
is
hit for
funny?
him.
He actually was filming F. Lee Bailey around the time he was doing this production, which is why he shaved his head. Because he had to shave his head for the F. Lee Bailey wig, but it also just worked for him being Roy Cohn to have this very brusque shave, like very buzz cut head, because it just worked at illustrating just the kind of tough nature, almost militaristic style that is Nathan Lane's performance in this. So I love Nathan Lane.
He's also a great technician. I mean, you can really see a very clear progression of the disease and how it ravages his body, and so he's just very clear about those kinds of choices.
Yeah. And even like when he's like pulling the fast one on Ethel and kind of tricking her into singing for him, as he does, even though we find out 5 seconds later that the character is full of shit, the actor is not. Like, he is definitely, this is a very just emotionally raw, true feeling performance in every way.
And I mean, once again, he's very flexible as a performer as well in this. Like, you see him play the very foppish ghost as well, which is a much more classic bird cagey Nathan Lane performance. And then you get this really awful, cruel man dying in a hospital bed. But even when he's dying, you're still kind of like, there's something in you that's...
He has a lot of tenderness in like scenes with Belize, and especially his big scenes with Joe. Like, I think there is a lot. Yeah, he's working with a lot here, and I think it is very commendable. And
he earned that Tony Award when this production came to Broadway. He rightfully earned that Tony Award as Roy Cohn. All right, well, let's dive deeper into the production. What was your favorite production or design element of this piece? Dana, I'll let you start this one.
Yeah, I really found that the entire design evolved in a satisfying way. I thought, it did what good design should do, which is reveal action. It really revealed the action of the play. And so we moved, even tracking the journey of the design from part 1, everyone, well, and also those little discrete buildings. Everyone had their own little discrete lives and locations, and they eventually disappeared as people's lives began to intertwine more and more in part 2. And then, by the middle of the play, Marianne Elliott has it staged. Some of this is how it's written, but some of it is how she staged it, that there are scenes overlapping. So Pryor's visible upstage in his hospital bed, right, as the scene unfolds between Lewis and Joe and Harper. But Perestroika in general featured a far more open mise en scène as people's lives open up to each other and transform. And this, I think this reflects the politics of the play as well. Perestroika was this reform movement within the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and it means restructuring. And it's closely tied to this other concept of glasnost, which means opening. So you get this sense of people's lives being restructured, people opening to each other, and we get that reflected in the mise en scène. To the point that by the end of the production, we can see in that final mise en scène. I'm just going to talk about the entire design here, okay? So,
go for it.
In the final mise en scène, you see the entire cosmos that Kushner has created present on the stage. You see this kind of ravaged architectural heaven. You see visible theatrical machinery, which is visible in that angel in the angel conference scene. And then you see this heavenly architecture, and then you see these earthbound fumbling humans, and there's the angel Bethesda right in between them, kind of hovering between, as divine intercessors do, in this beautiful vertical line that takes us from the cosmos, the architecture of the heavens, down to the earth. So I thought it was a really smart, eloquent design, just all the way around.
Yeah, love that. Kel, how about you? What was your favorite production design element?
I was gonna say, the scenography of Heaven, and it really evoked for me like a rundown sort of old glamorous theater, especially like San Francisco has a lot of like old golden age movie theaters and performing arts spaces, and I thought that fits so beautifully, both with Belize's monologue about what heaven is going to be like for him, and then when Harper gets on the plane as well to go find something else.
I like that. Actually, the sets of this, because this was directed by Marianne Elliott. And actually, I don't know if anybody else, I'm pretty sure nobody else was able to see her production of Company, because it was in the West End and it came to Broadway right before COVID. But the sets were actually very similar. All the neon boxes and the moving boxes, she brought that back for Company, with all the different worlds being shown in these boxes and the way she was able to change its size while still having a very barren stage. The minute I saw the sets, I was like, oh, I can see some Marianne Elliott carryover traits in her design work here.
I have to say, I didn't love those kind of squatty boxes at first. I found them, when I first started watching part one, which I tried to watch the whole thing, but I found them kind of ugly, actually. And then and sort of not really doing justice to suggesting a New York landscape. But when I saw how the design evolved over the whole piece, they made more sense to me. So, I forgave it.
I was also trying to like navigate how much of the perspective was being forced by the camera versus what the actual shape of the theater would have been. It was a bit hard to tell. But I'll keep that for my what was the worst element.
Yeah, we find that is often a recurring motif, since we're always reviewing pro shots here and we can't quite see them in the actual theater due to COVID and everything. So yeah, not all pro shots are created equal, and some definitely do warp that perspective.
Ryan, what was your favorite production design element?
So it's actually similar to what Dana brought up. It is kind of, I will call it the scene transitions, is in general what I really enjoyed. And Dana, you already mentioned the one that really kind of blew me away was that sort of nesting doll of the, we'll call it transparent second wall, because it's the back wall of each scene that we kind of can see through to the previous ones. And I didn't even really notice it happening at first until we got to Roy in the hospital at the end of Act 4 for his big death scene. Because that was just so downstage, and you could like see the heads of the audience like all kind of poking up underneath and like, wow, why is this so downstage? And then I kind of looked up and then noticed, oh my god, yeah, you can see all of the previous scenes nested behind it. And kind of, I don't know if it's a deliberate to think of it as a Russian nesting doll sort of that way, but how all of these lives are kind of collapsing into each other.
The theme of this.
Well, that's why I said it. But I think that, I don't know, that might just be my own kind of idiosyncratic reading of that. But the scene transitions in general were really like fantastic. So we went right out of the kiddish scene, or sorry, the cottage scene, not the kiddish scene. They make that joke in the play.
Very different.
Yeah, but the hospital set descends into the ground with Roy standing upright, so it looks like his spirit is ascending into the subsequent scene where his ghost visits Joe. So that's just like an incredible choice there. And then we get the exact sort of inverse of that when Pryor descends from heaven back into his hospital bed, and the hospital set ascends up, and he kind of like very fluidly swoops down into it. So yeah, all of the transitions I thought were just expertly designed, choreographed, executed, and yeah, definitely a standout element of the production for sure.
Yeah. I will say my favorite element of part 2 was the puppetry. It was something we didn't see much of in part 1, but then it really was big in part 2. And just first of all, the design work of all the puppets, whether it's the wings of the angel, which were like decrepit, and the corruptedness of that angel, or the really creepy Mormon puppets of the show within the show, was great. Like, it was just fascinating to watch how Marianne Elliott beautifully and seamlessly choreographed all these actors together to maneuver these puppets. Like, even with the Mormon puppets, there's somebody who's doing the head while somebody else is doing the arms.
Yeah.
Like, it's like all the work that went into that puppetry. It made those characters come alive. Like, those wings were so animated and weren't just the classic Halloween wings we put on when we're kids that are just kind of there, that just kind of are fluttering with like metal wire and fabric. This was like almost Julie Taymor-ish, like Lion King-y, like very animated, very alive puppetry work. Like the choreographing of the fight scene between Pryor and the Angel, where they're ripping the wings off and they're rolling around. Like, I had to watch that a few times just to watch how all this choreography was done, because I can't imagine the amount of time and effort that was done to get all these actors so in sync with each other to know how well to move with each other. Because when you're not in sync, I could see that puppetry going really wrong and really looking clumsy and bad. The fact that she was able to really choreograph this and work with her team in such a way to make this a seamless, cohesive unit, that even when there were, I think it was 2 people on each side of the wings, if I'm not mistaken, plus the actress in the middle. So like the fact that you have 5 people doing this angel.
Mm-hmm. And then not to mention then when they're wrestling with Pryor, having to get him into the mix too. And like, you know, all of the actors, like Joe, for example, in the Mormon diorama puppetry scene, like, yeah, I think there was a great integration of actors and puppeteers in like a unique way. And like, you know, you're shouting out the director here a lot, but I would say a special shout out for the puppetry should go to Finn Caldwell, who directed and designed all the puppetry there, and who, fun fact, also did the puppetry for the Lorax production that I just reviewed with Allie a couple weeks ago. So
there you go. Well, shout out to him. Shout out. Love that. Well, let's now get into what we thought was the weakest part of the production, because no production is ever perfect. Art is always changing, and there may not always be something we feel quite hit the mark. So, Ryan, I know you've been eagerly wanting to do this one.
So
what was your...
You're making me sound like a sadist. Like, I get no glee from this. And he was certainly, I think he did better in part 2 than he did in part 1. But Andrew Garfield, I'm sorry if you're watching this, is definitely the weak link in all of this.
Thank you for watching, Andrew, between your shooting of Spider-Man.
Like, yeah, I loved you in this. He's not doing Spider-Man anymore.
He is. He's in the new Marvel Spider-Man movie.
Is he? Oh, yes. That's strange. Okay, well, anyway,
it's a
loved
big
you in the Social
crossover.
Network. Yeah, but yeah, so I don't know. I don't know what, like, having not been on the previous panel, I don't know what was said about him in that one, but I
can summarize. Basically, it was felt that he was very broad. It felt I described it as Hank Azaria in the Birdcage. It was very much him doing his impression of somebody who was a part of the LGBTQIA+ community versus a human portrayal, which is what we get a lot from a lot of the other performers on stage. This was a very broad.
And I think that kind of sums up my thoughts in a nutshell. He's acting like someone who's never met a gay person before, acting how they think gay people are. Like, and I get that, you know, Pryor is a very over the top character, very kind of flamboyant and bombastic, but I think, you know, a lot of it could have been handled a lot more nuancedly. Kel, you want to chime in here?
Yeah. So, I get a sense of what you're mentioning, but the way that I viewed it was, in part 1, when, Pryor meets Harper, and he's done himself up, in drag to make himself feel better. I was like, oh, that is a defining moment of his character. And I see Pryor as someone who, in the face of something like awful that he's facing, really leans into the camp as a protective armor, because you watch the more camp elements get stripped away in heaven, and things like that. So I think where he was coming from as an actor is that this is Pryor's armor in a world that doesn't accept him for who he is.
I I think that's a well taken point, and like I think it's certainly a generous reading, and I think certainly backed up by the text. I'll give it that, but to me, then I think he was sort of just as over the top in like private scenes where it's just him and Lewis, even in part one. Like I didn't see like a division of I need to put my guard up, and that's when I default to this. It kind of felt very one note, and that one note was just a little too high. So high that nobody can reach it. That's freedom.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
I agree with you, Ryan.
Yeah, but I will say, just to not, because like, yeah, again, I think he is a genuinely talented actor, and he's certainly been good in other things, and I do think certainly where that armor is stripped away in part two, I think he does really come into his own in the role. He really is quite strong in his prophet moments.
That hospital scene with Hannah, I think it's his best.
Yeah, that is like a no armor moment. So I see that this could have been like an acting or directing choice going on in him. I just don't know if it was equally calibrated wherever it should have been.
If you were to say that the last monologue in the ending is a little bit too saccharine, I would give you that, though.
I would agree with that, yeah. But yeah, overall, I think he's better in part two, but he is, I think, still the weakest link of the whole.
Yeah, I did not find him much better in part two. And I if anything, I found him even more grating as a performance in this, because we're supposed to be identifying with Pryor in this, and his transformation as like the prophet, and when he goes into prophet mode and things like that. But he comes across as so rude and arrogant and just yelling at people. And I was like, I can't I'm not liking you right now. I'm not going on this journey with you because you're just so infuriating. There's just such an arrogance about this version of Pryor that I'm just like, I can't get behind the fact we have so many scenes with him in this. I was like, geez, like I know I'm supposed to be watching this big climactic conflict between him and the angel, but I'm like, he's just yelling so much, and it's all, as Ryan, you said, it's perfect. It's one note, it's a flat line, with maybe a BB very briefly when he has some of that empathetic, unguarded moments, but for the majority of the time, it's very loud in one note. That's hard to get past. And I was like, because like some lines were supposed to be funny, like they're like when he's in prophet mode, when he's first yelling at people.
And I think I'll admit I chuckled at some of them,
but they weren't as comedic as I think they were supposed to be. Because once again, Ryan, as you said, it's him playing someone, or at least him playing how he thinks people who are more flamboyant are.
And I don't want to necessarily
being performance.
Yeah, I don't want to psychoanalyze him as an actor, be like, he's clearly never met a gay person before, and that's what he thinks. Yeah. To me, that's just what it looks like, regardless of how accurate.
I mean,
that is.
Autumn. I think it was Autumn or Graham said it well, where this is because Andrew Garfield was not American, so it's almost like on top of trying to impose his interpretation of somebody who is flamboyant, he's also trying to interpret and include his version of what he thinks Americans are as well. The loud kind of far to the spectrums of the political sides, very loud voiced American as well. So there was a lot of that too. But even then, I was like, no, your journey. I know Kushner wants me to be a big supporter of Pryor's journey here, but I'm just like, no, there are so many other characters I'm wanting to watch right now versus Andrew Garfield Pryor. So,
I think a fair comparison. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Cal, you go first.
I was gonna say, I think a fair comparison, in terms of like playing Americanness would be, I think James McArdle, who plays Lewis, is from Glasgow. I don't know if he has like the strong Glaswegian accent. I haven't seen him in other stuff, but on his IMDb, I kind of did a double take because I was like, wow, that had me pretty well fooled. Yeah. It didn't seem over the top in its own Americanness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think they're both using some kind of like identity crutch. Like with Pryor, it's very much the kind of over-the-top gay voice that he's doing, whereas with Lewis, it's more of the Jew voice that, has certainly the queer undertones to it, but he's really like leaning into that New York Woody Allen kind of like type of, or Kushner-esque performance, you could say.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with so much of this. I had a problem with Prior to, and I really longed for the production in which we saw the kind of work that he was able to do in that hospital scene that we were talking about with Hannah. That was woven more through. I liked him much more towards the end of the production. I thought that after the scene in heaven, he calmed down and he was more powerful. And yes, there are some issues with that final monologue, but I do feel like, that's Kushner. That's not him, you know? And that, you know, on the other hand, like trying to imagine seeing this in 1990, what was it, 1 and 2?
So 1993 was when part 2 premiered.
91
was when part 1 came out.
So, you know, imagining him saying to all of the gay men in the audience and, you know, queer women, queer anybody, you know, saying like, we will be citizens. I mean, that must have been, I find it very moving. I don't even belong to that community. And it's, you know, and now there's so many more rights for the queer community, right? So, just to hear those words spoken, I think must have been shattering, you know? But anyway, I think, yeah, I longed for a production in which we saw more of what Andrew Garfield is clearly so capable of.
Yes.
Woven throughout the performance, or even this thing that you're saying, Cal, which I think is such a really interesting note about the camp being a kind of armor, but seeing moments, like you were mentioning, Ryan, where he chooses to put that on because he's faced with something that he can't handle, you know? And you're right. I don't think that I didn't see that as a kind of choice, or conscious or not. We still saw him very much, you know, up in the stratosphere, even in his most intimate scenes with Lewis. So, yeah, I second all of that.
I would also chip in just to say that even though something is saccharine, I still like it. I still buy into Kushner telling me that things are going to be good in the future. Well, I buy into Felice's, like, I don't have to love America speech. I buy into Lewis's, have you no decency? Like,
yeah, like there's no questioning that Kushner is like an amazing playwright. Like that this is not on trial here. And like Data, to your point about that sort of final line, then though we will be citizens, like this play is arguably partly responsible for a lot of the progress that came. There's this great book. I'm actually reading this right now. It's called Mainstream AIDS Theater, the Media and Gay Civil Rights Making the Palatable Radical by Jacob Yuntunen. And it's, Kel, are you writing this down?
No. I'm pulling out
what do you got
a copy of The World Only Spins Forward, which is the oral history of interest in America, but it intersects a lot with ACT UP as well.
Yeah, well, the argument in this book is that, you know, so much of the scholarship on LGBTQ theater has been about the radical and looking at the forgotten texts that didn't make it into the mainstream and, you know, realizing that there's a forgotten history that needs to be uncovered. But Yuntunen's argument in this book is that, you know, although it sort of plays the game of the mainstream capitalist Broadway producing infrastructure, it is through mainstreaming these radical ideas in plays like these and opening them up to the world that they actually entered the zeitgeist in this way that just fetishizing the radical doesn't quite do. And, you know, in the book, in the Angels in America chapter, he pays great attention to how that line actually is prophetically paid off in that, like, a year before this book was written, in 2015, suddenly gay marriage was, you know, with the Supreme Court, and it was legalized across the country, and that citizenship has entered the mainstream in a way that it really could only be dreamed of in the 1990s. So, sorry, tangent there, but I'm reading it right now, and it's on my mind.
I mean, Ryan, you got me thinking so much more about Broadway shows that have opened the doors and have allowed for certain communities to actually come into the spotlight that were not given those opportunities before. Thinking about shows that now maybe we would look back on and go, ooh, I don't know if maybe we could do that show anymore, but the fact they opened so many doors and were able to do so much. And whether it's Angels in America, a Miss Saigon, Once on This Island, that just opened doors for certain communities that just weren't there at the time, and saying and being able to voice messages that then became mainstream. I think it's so interesting that what it takes to actually get something to go to a mainstream audience, when maybe there was a lot more subtle works that maybe didn't quite hit because they weren't so loud in their messaging. So fascinating. You just got me on a whole new tangent, Ryan. My brain spins.
I think, like, to take it in a slightly different direction, too, in The World Only Spins Forward, they talk about the early development of the production, and it's not a show that started on Broadway. Like, the first 2 or 3 workshops were, like, held together with duct tape. They might have been, I think one was part of a university where Kushner might have been the artist in residence or something like that, just to have a space. And everything was people being paid like $300 for like a week's worth of like just pulling together. So I think that it really is like its bones are in an indie hit in a San Francisco style make theater in a cafe. And then its acclaim kind of got ahead of itself. Not in a bad way. I think its acclaim is all deserving, but that starting out, nobody thought they were making a Broadway enduring masterpiece legacy, anything like that either. So I think that really shapes the heart of the piece.
Yeah, and in fact, after it was in San Francisco, and then it was at the Eureka Theater commissioned it, and then it was at the Mark Taper Forum, and then before it ever went to Broadway, it had a really important production at the National Theater, directed by Mcdonald, and it was from there it got so much buzz. There's this really interesting anecdote about how I can't remember what year it was. It must have been I can't remember what year it was, but there was this anecdote about Ian McKellen doing some kind of presentation at the Tonys, and he said he was talking about this kind of cultural exchange between Britain and the U.S. And he said, right now over in England, there's this play Angels in America. It's going to be so huge, and there's this kind of smattering of applause in the audience. He said, just you wait, it's going to come here, it's going to win every Tony. And of course, sure enough, it did. But it had its feet on the ground in this acclaimed production over there first.
What I really like too is that in the 50th anniversary celebration of the National Theater, they have the park bench scene from Millennium Approaches, and I think it's Dominic Cooper and one other actor who's escaping me right now, but that they put it in the mosaic of like most important productions they've done in 50 years, and it really does have that spot. And I think that was 2013. So yeah.
So weakest element of the production. I love that we went on these tangents because this is amazing. I love bringing the scholars into the room. But did anyone have a weakest production element that wasn't Andrew Garfield? I know we've gotten far from the original question. But...
Cal, what was yours?
I was going to say that some of the lighting choices felt murky or confused, while trying to recognize that like it probably looked different when not on video. But it was hard to find something to criticize in a production that I really liked so much.
See, it's interesting you say that, because I was actually considering, if I didn't love the scene transition so much, lighting was almost going to be my number one pick for the... But like, I agree that maybe some moments, are there specific moments you have in mind of which ones struck you as?
I know that some of the, like hospital lighting, when there were multiple scenes happening on, I was like, okay, things tend to feel a little blurred. But
yeah.
And also the Joe and Louis scenes that take place in their apartment too. When multiple things are going on, I was like, I feel slightly confused as to how big this room is or where it is, but also stylistic choices.
Yeah.
Like,
no, I think that those kind of like isolated moments are fair to kind of just yeah, harp on a little bit. What I would have complimented overall is I did like the neon aesthetic and the trim on everything, 'cause especially I had a little mixed feelings about it in part one, but then when the ladder came down in part two,
Yes.
because
Yes,
to me
exactly.
that is the reconciliation of the kind of New York Broadway neon aesthetic and the heaven is San Francisco, creating that, because the way that in the text, and I check back in the text to look it up, the ladder is described as a ladder of even brighter, purer light appears, and to make that just purple neon, that's kind of cohesive with the rest of the lighting in the piece, but purple this time, I think, kind of really sold that moment. So I almost gave that lighting the shout out, and I guess I did just now. Found a way to do it.
Dana, did you have any other elements you wanted to add for weakest production element, or was Andrew Garfield your choice as well?
Andrew Garfield was my choice as well. But I also, it's interesting, Kel, about, that you found that the actor playing Lewis, I found like him to be kind of like, I thought he was very good, but I also don't think he quite had the New York, the like Ashkenazi, Eastern European Jewish thing, this trope that Kushner is playing with. And I mean, it's like, we can't, just like with Pryor, it's like, we can't say that all Jews talk or look one sort of way, obviously, but he's playing with a kind of specific trope. And I feel like some of his Yiddish inflected stuff, I was like, I don't know. But anyway, yeah. But mine was mainly for Andrew Garfield.
Poor Andrew Garfield. We're sorry. Thanks for sticking around with us
Listen,
this
he
long,
was great in Hacksaw Ridge and a bunch of other movies.
Yeah, he's a good actor. That's why I'm
He's a
kind of
good
disappointed about this.
Yeah.
Like, as one of the headlining stars who is a big name who's been in the pictures, like, you kind of expect a little more, is all I'm saying.
Yes, exactly. Well, let's get into this next question then. So, do we think this production was worth the watching, and does part 2 work as a standalone piece? Ryan, I'll let you start this one.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so first of all, I love that you usually kind of flip this question to me as a TA, as a future prof, will you assign this? And being in a room with all these academics, we can kind of explore that a little bit from different perspectives, not just mine. So yeah, first of all, I think this production is worth a watch. I would 100% recommend people check it out. Obviously, Angels in America is this big kind of monumental piece. I think everybody should seek out opportunities to see. It's a wonderful play. Story time. When this, remember the before 4 times before COVID, when you could actually see things like in the world? So I didn't see this live, in London, but when the NT Live movie theater showings were happening, I think Kel, you and I talked about this at the time. But yeah, so I was excited to see it then, and I went to the movie theater and saw part 1, and opted against seeing part 2 at the time. Not because I didn't want to see it. It just there was a lot of stuff. Again, Andrew Garfield is a big part of it, and as we said, he gets a little better in part 2. But I thought I kind of felt like I think I'm good after part 1, and didn't feel the need to go back and pay another ticket price for the whole to see the whole. Now that it's online and you don't have to pay individually per show to see it, I was very excited to finally kind of check back in with part 2, and that's also part of why I'm happy to be on this panel, not like the revisiting the one that I was a little more lukewarm on. And having now seen the whole sweep of it, I do think it kind of, overall, it's a very strong production. It does bring a lot of great stuff together. And, if we are, from a pedagogical standpoint, if I were teaching Angels in America and I wanted to show something to the students or just tell the students to seek out this production, I do think it's either this or the mini-series is kind of what it comes down to. There isn't another pro shot of Angels in America to see, unless you want to just on YouTube find a bootleg of a university production. And I love the mini-series. I think it's great. But in a theater history or dramatic literature course, I would want to expose students to an actual theater version that's not taking those adaptational liberties that are sort of a necessity. And I think Mike Nichols did a great job with it, but it's not watching the play, in my opinion. It is an adaptation in every sense of the word. Mm-hmm. So I would certainly use this as, in pedagogy, I would direct students towards this production, at least until another better one comes along that I can maybe point to instead. To the second part of this question, does part 2 work as a standalone? A bit of a loaded question there, but because obviously I don't know if you can just pick up watching a part 2 and feel like I've seen a complete play. I question whether or not you can do that with part 1, but if we're speaking in pedagogical terms, often we don't have 2 weeks to devote to Angels in America in a course like Kelwin. We were doing theater history 2 back at U Ottawa with Peter Cooling. We only did part 1, and we deprived the students of part 2, which hopefully many of them did seek it out and read the whole thing and maybe watch, the productions or at least the whole miniseries. But yeah, I think with limited time and resources in academia, we tend to only have to pick one, and part 1 just makes more sense because it is the setup. It kind of more or less works as a complete play, even though the big revelations all happen, I think, in part 2. I have a hard time mapping part 1 onto like a Freytag pyramid, or even like 6 consecutive Freytag pyramids for each of its main characters, whereas you can do that with the entirety of part 1 and 2 together. And I think part 2, because the payoffs all happen, to me makes for a more enjoyable viewing and reading experience. So as a dramaturg, my temptation would be to call up my good friend Tony Kushner, we're very close, and say to him, listen, Tony, my guy, what you should really do is, I know that it's been decades since he wrote the play, he probably is so done with it by now, but what we should do is rewrite a standalone version of each play. Like, cut out things that are only kind of existing to pay off stuff in part 1 that don't need to be in part 2, and we can maybe get it down to like 2.5 hours of just like a solid razor thin.
I would support that, Ryan. This is a very long play.
Like, I'm not saying, oh, it's too long, there's fat to be trimmed. It's more from a state of only the very big companies are really able to do justice to the entire sweep of it. And I think we can get more interesting and more creative productions of it if there wasn't this commitment to have to do both parts, or just do part 1 if you can only afford to do one, because most of my favorite stuff happens in part 2. So if Kushner, sitting down with a dramaturg, here's my number, it would be interested in, coming up with the standalone version of part 2 that could just work as a, production in its own right, I think more companies would be interested in producing that than just part 1, and maybe even the whole sweep of it, which gets very expensive very quickly. Yeah, so sorry, Dave, do you want to chime in there?
No, go ahead.
Well, and I guess we're getting a little far away from the question of does this production, I wouldn't tell anyone to just watch part 2 of this production. If somebody wants to watch this production, I'd say watch them both. They're both, especially if we're on like NT at Home, this streaming platform where you can watch them both at your leisure and aren't beholden to the theater or cinema timetable as I was back then when I opted not to return for part 2. I think part 2 is definitely the stronger of the two halves. It is certainly more thematically coherent than part 1 is. Part 2, I think, is very focused on the theme of progress. And that there certainly are seeds of that in part 1, but I can't quite pin down what I would say is part 1 is about on its own. The way that I say part 2, everything comes back to progress. Progress versus stasis, or the dialectic between the two. Long way of saying yes, but also no, but also yes. Someone else talk.
Perfect. Dana, you were to talk before, so I'll let you jump in.
I don't know. I think, I agree that if you have any opportunity to see a Kushner play in action, you should see it no matter who's doing it, because I think that his work is such a creature of the theater. I mean, obviously he's written great film screenplays as well, but he's such a creature of the theater. He's so in debt to Brecht that when you have to watch the theatrical mechanism unfolding. And I think that, I know that it's almost 8 hours long, but it is only an 8-character play. And, not 8-character, but 8-actor play. And it can be done, I think, with the most bare bones sort of technology. I saw a classroom sort of production of it where the angel was on a ladder and, a ladder on wheels. And it was very, very bare bones. And I think it worked quite well. So I think that's to his credit. Does it work as a standalone piece? I don't know. I think it's so much a part of theater history that if you're going to just watch part 2, you probably have some, I want to say prior knowledge, but that's just terrible. But anyway, but I think of this piece as I think of it as a kind of medieval altarpiece that it's a diptych and the two things go together. So yes, you could look at one panel of, Bosch's, The Garden of Earthly Delights or something like that, but you're not going to get the entire cosmic scale of the piece. And I do think it's an apt metaphor because Kushner was he was a medieval studies major as an undergraduate at Columbia. So I think that he's really interested in that kind of cosmic scale. So if you just watch the first one and it culminates in the angel's descent, then what does that mean? You have to have the second half. But if you don't have the first half without the second half, then you miss all of that, the kind of, anxiety and benighted state of the characters and the, when Harper and Pryor have that conversation and, she says that, I can't remember her line, but he talks about how it's all been done before. And, they're talking about this feeling of flatness to the world. And then here comes this angel bursting in, so I think that one is an answer to the other. So I guess I'm going to end with yes, but kind of no, but also maybe yes.
This is very much what we did in the first part as well. It was a yes and kind of no answer to this question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think what occurs to me, Dana, while you're saying that is if you were to do the dramaturgical exercise that I'm describing and rewrite a version of each part that is not, beholden to what happens or did happen in the other part, I don't think you can get away with doing part 1 and still have it end with the angel showing up, because that is such a cliffhanger. Like, that is like a big things are coming in part 2, just you wait. And if you cut the angel out, then you might as well cut out the flaming book and the Hebrew and the, all of these. And then you kind of just wind up with, I won't say a worse version of, but a different version of something like The Normal Heart. Like, you just have this kind of grounded drama about men dealing with AIDS. And I like The Normal Heart a lot, in fact. But this isn't, you wouldn't, I don't know. My dramaturgical faculties are failing me to think of like a good way to retain it.
I don't think there's a need to try to rewrite it. I don't think Kushner's hurting for production opportunities.
No,
so I don't think it's an exercise he would need to do. I hear what you're saying as a kind of like thought exercise, but at the same time, it's like, it's a symphony. And if you cut a movement out of it, you start to pull threads out of it. Apparently the original draft of Perestroika was 700 pages long. So like actually 700 pages. So he cut a lot.
In the words of Fiddler, if you pull out a prop, where does it stop? Where does it stop? So there you go. Trying to cut this. I don't know if you could. Cal, what are your thoughts?
Mine is like an unequivocal no, this doesn't stand alone, and it doesn't need to. My favorite opera is Einstein on the Beach, Robert Wilson, Philip Glass. Like, it's 5 hours. I'm really appreciative of like durational pieces, and the kind of like challenge it takes to love them, because I feel like there's a reward when you do really, really get into them. And like Ryan said, if I were teaching theater history over like a 12-week period, I would probably assign both halves and say, look, just deal with it. It's a long one. Most of these plays are 100 pages. I'll sign Kraft's Last Tape to make up for it. That's like a page long.
Plan accordingly, students. It's not hard to do. You're adults. Yes. For me,
I was not a well-planned student. I'm going to throw that in right here. Ryan knows I did tons of stuff at the last minute.
And yet you got A pluses and everything, so what are you complaining about?
It all worked out for you. I will say for me, having now watched part 1 and part 2, I do like part 1 more.
Really?
As a play. I do. Well, once again, Ryan, you know I'm a bit more the fan of the normal heart root of the story, which is the two men parallel stories going through the AIDS epidemic, versus the angel, bit more Brechtian, symbolizing stuff. So for me, I do enjoy part 1 more, because I do enjoy the Pryor and Roy journeys more in part 1 than I do in part 2. I really do see this as two parallel stories of two men with AIDS. You have Roy in his descent, and you have Pryor in his ultimate rise. So I do enjoy part 1 though more, but I will say, due to the stunning visuals of part 2, you should watch part 2 just for that alone. But as we've all said, trying to watch part 1 and part 2 and separate them really doesn't work, because part 1 does end on such a great cliffhanger of the angel appearing that you do want to see this angel in action in part 2 that you've been promised. I will say though, this pro shot has cornered the market of Angels in America. There is no other option if you were to do this as a theater history visual aid. So basically, you'd have to watch this. If I was to show like general people, like my parents, I would probably start with the HBO miniseries Al Pacino, Meryl Streep, first, because it's a bit more episodic. You can kind of take some breaks a bit more if you're watching at home. And then if they liked this story and were really compelled, then if this ever did come to Toronto again or was mounted somewhere close by, I would then go, let's go see this live and do a day at the theater, where we'll do part 1 in the matinee, and then we'll do part 2 in the evening. We'll have a nice dinner in between where we can debate this play. But yeah, I definitely think I would just start general audiences with HBO first, and then get to this, because I feel the cast with the Meryl Streep, Al Pacino, and I forget who else is in. I forget who plays Pryor in that.
Pryor was played by Justin Kirk.
Justin Kirk.
And you have Mary Louise Parker as Harper. It's a really good cast.
It's a really good cast, and I think just because of Andrew Garfield's performance, I don't know if for a general audience I would want to start them with this, just because Andrew Garfield is such a divisive performance that if part 1 where you're really not into him, and then you got to sit through almost 4 hours of part 2, but I'm pretty sure my parents would go no. But if they were watching part 1, which I think is a much stronger way of interpreting Pryor in that, I think that's where you would start. But overall, this is still a great, interesting piece of theater that any good member of the arts community should watch, and then people who even watched the HBO version maybe weren't sure about it after that, still give this a chance, because once again, Kushner has told a beautiful, epic, sprawling story, and was really kind of cutting edge at the time when he did this. And I think just to watch that and realize the significance of what this part 2 and part 1 really meant to the arts community and to the world at the time. I mean, the fact that people had to wait 2 years to see the sequel or the part 2 of this play is wild. I can imagine nowadays.
2 years.
Yeah, I can't imagine that. I mean, recently the most recent 2-part play that's kind of taken the world is this Harry Potter Cursed Child play, and the fact that part 1 and part 2 came out at the same time. There was no real break in that. So the fact that people had to wait for this, I think it's just worth knowing and watching.
The real kind of obvious parallel to draw for another big 2-part play is The Inheritance by Matthew Lopez, which takes a lot of cues from Angels in America, and it is very much the. It's been several years since, or several decades even, since Angels in America, and Matthew Lopez stands on Tony Kushner's giant shoulders in a lot of great ways. And and honestly, like, I am torn between which of the two plays I like more, because like it's a very different play and very similar. I don't know, have any of you read it or seen the production of it?
I have not seen it, but Ron, I thought you would have selected for your favorite two-part play Nicholas Nickleby.
I like Nicholas Nickleby, and eventually we will release those 9 episodes we filmed about that, and the world will get to see all my thoughts in detail. But like, stay tuned for that. But no, I think reading The Inheritance with Angels in America kind of ghosted in the back of your head is a bit of a trip, because there is so much interesting comparison, and in some ways it suffers by, you're kind of just doing a sort of more 21st century variation of that thing. Reagan becomes Trump, et cetera, but it also kind of leaves you on a very sort of, things are going to start getting supernatural cliffhanger at the end of part 1. But yeah, I do think that it benefits just as much as it loses from this comparison, and it is very clearly, there is a mechanism to this intertext that I think is worth exploring, and I'm sure some scholars probably have already started digging into it.
Yeah. For sure.
As a note on the HBO series, I remember my dad buying it at Costco, and my dad has seen 5 plays grand total in his life. And he just kind of went, HBO, Meryl Streep, Al Pacino, like, let's buy that. And like, that sat on my shelf for years when I was a child, before I was like, wait, what, we have this? What's up with this? Yeah.
So you're saying this is your theater origin story?
Oh, for sure. Like, this is definitely one of the, like, very, like, first plays that I was into, beyond, like, the typical, like, Christmas Carol, Nutcracker, stuff like that. I think I saw it first around, like, 14, 15, and the big draw to it for me, was I went to a really, really conservative Catholic school, and trying to find out how to exist in that world as someone who wasn't Catholic, and also like not jiving with a lot of that conservative ethos. Angels in America is also this like the fundamental big question is like, how do we exist in the world when everything else is so much to hold all the time? So I guess that was the draw for me. Kind of a tangent there, but
I think all schools should read this play just for that Hannah and Pryor scene alone in the hospital. I think that answers the question of how do we exist in the world today with differing views.
I feel like it would have gotten banned at my school. We had
most likely.
We had many things that were not allowed to be put on by the drama department. There was a long list. So
yes, well, I mean, let's dive into a bit more textual play-based questions, because, we like to balance out our conversations. So first off, let's tackle one of the big elements of part 2, which is how are we meant to interpret the dream sequences in part 2? Why do you think Kushner made this element more prevalent in part 2 than they were in part 1? Dana, I know this is kind of your area of expertise, as it were, so I'll let you kind of kick this one off a bit.
Yeah, a little bit maybe. Sure.
Yeah, a little bit.
My research is on the intersection of religion and theater, specifically contemporary American drama and performance. And actually, the stuff I look at is post 2000, but I feel like Angels is a kind of text in certain ways, and getting to spend a lot of time with it over these past couple of weeks, it's been really eye-opening for all of the stuff that comes after. So I think that the dream sequences are one element in a larger, an even larger thing that Kushner is doing. He introduces, I sort of quoted this and then botched part of it earlier, but in this conversation when Pryor and Harper first meet, Harper says the world is finite. She's sort of bemoaning, as a person, supposedly this person of faith, she's been bemoaning that the world is finite, and Pryor says it's all been done before. And then pretty soon after, you hear this voice saying, look up, look up. So there's this sense of a kind of the philosopher Charles Taylor calls the modern horizontal imaginary. That we live in a world that's closed, that's disenchanted. And I think what Kushner is offering here is that the world once again becomes porous. It becomes open to all of these other realms. And he actually stages the literal moment of opening when the angel crashes through the ceiling, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I can't remember which character is saying this about, you know, America. There are no angels in America,
it's
right?
Lewis.
That America, that's Lewis. Yeah, of course it's Lewis. that America is this disenchanted place, but they all discovered that this is not in fact true, and I think that's what Kushner is posing for us. So the dream sequences are just part of this porous reality that the world is haunted, it's enchanted, it's connected in ways that we can't even imagine. And so, you know, I think Kushner is also really indebted to a lot of things, but I think he's really interested in Jewish mysticism. I think that's kind of part of where he's coming from. And there's an idea in a lot of Jewish mystical, texts that the earthly realm and the heavenly realm are constantly, affecting each other. So if you repair something in the earthly realm, it's repairing something in the heavenly realm, or vice versa. So I think, you know, that stunning image at the end of the play that Harper gives us in the kind of penultimate scene of the play about the souls of the dead rising and clinging to each other and repairing the ozone hole, you know, that there's this longing, that all those many, many, many deaths have not been in vain. The deaths, that are, you know, most visible in the play being all these deaths because of AIDS. But, you know, maybe also Ethel Rosenberg and maybe the Holocaust and maybe everything else, you know, is kind of looming back there, that they haven't been in vain, that they're not forgotten, that there's this fusion between the physical and spiritual realms. So I think that the dream sequences are part of that whole, opening of the cosmos, that Kushner is really trying to stage for us. Yeah.
Ryan, I'll let you go next, because this was a debate you and I had when we were trying to write this question, was how to get this down. Because you and I have a
difference of opinion.
Let's just say difference of opinion on these dream sequences. You're a bit more of a fan of them than I am. Mm-hmm. So, what are your thoughts on these dream sequences?
Well, yeah, like I think Dana hit the nail on the head with a lot of this, but to me, where my mind goes with it is that there's, I guess the question that looms in my mind is, are we meant to take these as literally happening in the world of the play? Obviously, as a play, this isn't our real world, and we can take it as a metaphor either way, but I kind of love the moment when Prior wakes up from the dream and does the Wizard of Oz. I had the most lovely dream, and you were there, and it's so funny because, like the Wizard of Oz, it's the same actors playing the same angels, yes. And you know, great moment. But I wonder, because so much of it happens like in dreams, in like these dream sequences, are we meant to interpret as such? I think Belize has a great line when Prior is first describing to him, you know, what the angel told him and how the angel put the book inside him. And when they talk about how God abandoned the world, well, he says, abandoned, I smell a motif. And he's saying, like, is this just your way of coping with Lewis's betrayal of you and leaving you? I think it works both ways, because, like, on one hand, like, to bring it back to medievalism, because Dana, you're very, you know, correct in pointing out that Kushner, he studied medieval literature. He's very interested in theology and mysticism. I do see this as a kind of morality play in the medieval sense of the word, and it is certainly allegorical and playing with these ideas and trying to give us a myth for today, or a new myth that plays on a lot of what comes before. It's this very sort of postmodern bricolage that certainly engages with so much theology. We're dealing with Jews and Mormons and, you know, wasps to a certain extent, less so in the dream sequence. But I don't feel like I have a good answer to to the second part of the question about like why is it so much more prevalent in part two, and I think it just comes down to that Freytag pyramid, is that it's what we're building towards in part one, and the seeds of it are planted there, but it is the payoff to this kind of grounded realism that we are introduced to, like in Brechtian realism, but certainly like possibly an oxymoron, but it also occurs to me, like, if you read a lot of the kind of more recent scholarship on this play, I've noticed a bit of a revisionist history trend that tries to, and like Yuntunen, who I just kind of cited earlier, in that Making the Radical Palatable book kind of is, I think, a little guilty of this too, of underplaying the kind of, surrealist, mystical, kind of over-the-top avant-garde elements of this play. And, Nelson Presley, in his book about the anti-political prejudice in contemporary theater, kind of does this too. There's, a lot of recent scholars kind of have been underplaying how out there a lot of the stuff in this play is, and said, oh, it's a very realistic play about, men struggling with AIDS. And, like, you could only make that argument if you only watch part one and slept through certain scenes in it, like because part two really does, like I get that it's not necessarily maybe as radical as something like Slave Play or even Water by the Spoonful or even Einstein on the Beach, to kind of use like certainly like other avant-garde texts of our day, or Einstein on the Beach a little old now, but still. But yeah, I think to revive a point that I made earlier, I like A Normal Heart, but I don't want every play about AIDS to be A Normal Heart. And I like that Angels in America is its own unique experimental cosmos of how we engage with faith and the history thereof.
I think so many times theater, especially theater academics are like really allergic to religion, so that's like a whole other thing.
That's what you need to correct,
which is what I'm writing about. But I think if I could just sort of briefly say something about the second part of the question, why is it more prevalent in part two than part one, is because the world cracks open. Mm-hmm. History cracks open, right, is the line. So it all cracks open. We get openness, going back to the meanings of Perestroika and its related idea of glasnost, that it's not just that history is opening up. It's not just that these people's lives are opening up, but the cosmos opens up,
Yeah.
And that's why we get even more confusion between ontological realms. There's more confusion between the dream space and the real space, more confusion between the heavenly and the pedestrian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about you, Cal? What do you think?
I saw you grabbing a book there.
Yeah, I pulled the collected plays of Paul Rudnick off my shelf, and the first play in this collection, Jeffrey, is contemporary to A Normal Heart. I can look up what exact year it came out, but it also involves the AIDS crisis. It also involves dream sequences, but it is very heavily a comedy because Rudnick came into it with this sort of like, we need to laugh in the midst of this as well. And I think that he gets talked about less in comparison to Tony Kushner, Larry Kramer, all those other figures. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think I just throw this one in. If people are like, oh, I want to have more things I can put in conversation with Angels of America, that's one for me that would be interesting to look at the use of dreams. And then about dream sequences specifically, my favorite one is actually in Millennium Approaches when Pryor and Lewis are dancing and he says, "Are you a ghost, Lou?" And he says, "No, just spectral," because the setup for that for me is like, it already makes you question, okay, this is happening in Pryor's like dreamscape, but is it also happening to Lewis? Like, are these figments of a single character's imagination, or are they happening in tandem? And I don't, and it doesn't get resolved, but it's good that it doesn't get resolved in that way either, because you then have like this beautiful collage of all of these different points. And the one place that it comes up in Perestroika that leaves me questioning is the kiss between Joe and Roy, and whose dream is that happening in? Mm-hmm. If Roy's actually a ghost there.
Yeah. Like, I think there is a lot of interesting places to trace this overlap. Like, Pryor and Harper's relationship only exists in dreams, and yet they remember each other through. Now, is that just always Harper remembering her imaginary friend Pryor, or vice versa? And yeah, I don't know what to make of that, but Pryor gets on the plane at the end and has learned about heaven, a place like San Francisco. So
they meet at the Mormon Visitor Center.
Yes, so they do. But that's also a bit of a dream sequence in its own right, like, or at least becomes.
Yeah, because you have the puppet.
Yeah, the diorama comes to life after he leaves. Yeah, so, and it's weird. There isn't like a clear threshold where I have fallen asleep and now I'm dreaming. Yeah. The worlds are very much colliding into each other. And
which is clearly purposeful. It's clearly on purpose, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think Kushner wants us to leave with, man, what crazy dreams they all had. Like Hannah, certainly, when she kind of comes out of her dream, and like, I had the strangest dream about making out with the angel. But I think it's best for some characters to think they were dreaming, but still taking those lessons, into the world with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, these dream sequences. Whew. How do I follow up all this great intellectual input?
You could just say you don't like them. We won't judge.
Well, no, I mean, I actually went back and watched the main dream sequences of part 2. Because coming out of watching part 2 the first time, I was a bit put off. I think I was more Andrew Garfield that put me off a lot of these dream sequences, because he's in a lot of them.
We're so sorry, Andrew Garfield, but thank you for sticking with us.
Yeah, thank you, buddy. But yeah, I mean, like, the dream sequences, they are muddy. Like, it's very Shakespearean almost, with that mix of real world, dream world. It almost felt a bit like that Midsummer, where it's like the characters don't know if they were dreaming or if they were awake, or Bottom with the whole donkey's head thing. Like, Kushner never gives you a straight answer to these questions. It's meant to be interpretive, which is nice, because I do like theater that isn't just cut and dry. I do like theater that gives you a bit to think about and leaves you something to go talk about at the bar. I think for me, like, the prior ones were most easiest for me to kind of get mentally into symbolizing what was going on there, because for me that angel really came across as like the AIDS itself within him, because a lot of times these AIDS or these angel dreams come from his fever, right? Like, he's in these fever dreams. So his struggle with this angel and these conversations he's having is almost like this internal battle between him and the AIDS, which is nice, because I don't know what else you could really do with Pryor in part 2 unless you just wanted to make him sick in a bed like Roy. And if that's the case, then that's going to become very flatline. You needed something like this to kind of give a bit more juice to warrant a part 2 of the story, because if you just have both Roy and Pryor in beds experiencing AIDS, well, I'm sure you could do a really interesting play of having Roy Cohn and his roommate in a room together.
Like, I'd watch it, but that's not what this play is.
Right? That's exactly it. So for me, I go like, I think you needed this bit of Angel Pryor battle to go on here to help illustrate this sickness that Pryor is working through, and how he ultimately is the one that survives the end of the play.
See, so, Mac, yeah. I question, because I think there's a bit of a maybe top-down, bottom-up approach. I'm not sure which one is more applicable here, where I feel like you're operating under the assumption that Kushner wanted to write a play about these men suffering with AIDS, and he didn't know what to do with them, so he came up with this whole fantastical thing that Pryor would get up to. Whereas I feel like, I don't know, contrary to what I said before, I don't know Kushner personally, but I feel like it was probably maybe the opposite, where I think there is this kind of fantastical like play that he had inside him, and then engaging with what was politically on his mind at the time, certainly, like while he was writing it, like it fed into the AIDS epidemic very well, or that the two kind of happen in tandem. But I wouldn't quite say that, well, what's Pryor going to do in part two? Let's give him this kind of vision quest.
Yeah,
like
well, for sure. Like, I don't know what Kushner's writing creative process was. I just know that if you didn't have this angel stuff in prior storyline, I don't know where else you could really take that character in a part two thing. Like, Roy has a great journey between part one and part two, and we're going to get into that shortly. I mean, Lewis and Joe have a great story. Hannah has a great story that warrants a larger exploration. Pryor's the one character where I look at that and go, I don't know where else you could go with him in a second part unless you went this kind of bigger route that Kushner's given him. And it's a fascinating, like, watching it again. I think the first time Andrew Garfield really put me off the first time. But once I was able to kind of push that aside and just watch the scenes for what they are and listen to Kushner's text, it gave me a whole new appreciation for what he had written. Mm-hmm. So, yes.
There's a really interesting story that when the play was commissioned, Oscar Eustis, who was the artistic director of the Eureka at the time, when he commissioned it, they basically gave Tony Kushner carte blanche because he had seen his first show and it was like he loved it, and so he said, what do you want to write about? And there was this weird pot of ingredients that got put in there, but one of them was Kushner said that I think it was in 1985 when the first person that he ever knew died of AIDS, who was this young man who was a dancer, and he died. He said he had a dream. Kushner had a dream about his death, and in the dream, an angel crashed through the ceiling, and he wrote a poem about it, and he called the poem "Angels in America," and he put it away. And so it's interesting how, just hearing us sort of debate this issue of the dreams, it's interesting to me that the impetus for this play was partly from this actual dream he had. Yeah. And there was also an interest in Roy Cohn. His dad gave him a book about the McCarthy era, and then as a medieval studies major, he was sort of keenly aware that as the year 2000 was approaching, the sort of apocalypse and millennium feelings, that were swirling around in the Middle Ages, he was beginning to feel them again in his own time. So, but it's interesting how they all came together from this dream.
And I don't think we could ever question that, both AIDS and the kind of angelic ethos were part of the kind of inception, sort of starting premise of this play at the outset. Yeah. But yeah, it is kind of important to think of them as unfolding in tandem and not something that he added on, because where is this character's journey possibly going to go? I think, they are holding hands in lockstep all the way through.
I also, think of Ellen McLaughlin originating the role of the angel as she was dying of cancer at the time, and how much, I know that Kushner says that really shaped the process of the play, because he would show up to rehearsal with new bits that were sort of informed by watching this close friend go through that process as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also just kind of this is sort of a little disconnected, but one other tidbit, the staging, or the costuming at least, of the angel that we have in this production sounds an awful lot like a description of what Robert Altman describes, because he was originally tasked with doing a film version before Mike Nichols took it over for HBO. And there's an interview you can read about Robert Altman describing how he kind of envisioned his version of it, and this sort of dusty, decrepit, dying, broken angel is very similar to the description he gives there. So design, costume, directing, I don't know who we credit it to, but interesting to see that sort of lineage of the version we didn't get in the film cropping up in this production.
Yeah, love that. All right, well, let's get into our next question, which I'm sure will yield some very interesting answers here. So, does Roy Cohn's death redeem him? Does our viewpoint of the actual historical figure prevent us from ever sympathizing with him? Cal, I'll let you start this one.
For me, like, no, there's no redeeming Roy Cohn. There's no redeeming the historical Roy Cohn. There's no redeeming the fictional Roy Cohn, who was pretty closely in line with some of the aspects of the real one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but that's okay, because I like watching characters who are bad. And I also think that his scene with Belize, where he lets Belize take one of the bottles of pills, is so indicative of his character, because
he corrupts Belize to get the pills.
He I don't know if corrupt is the right word, but he I think prides himself on being like, I tell it like it is, and everyone else is just pretending to be as good or as PC as they say there. So when he can pick at that in Belize, and have Belize sort of snap, he sees that as like, okay, I've won. You know,
he brings
have this. Yeah. In short, he doesn't need to be sympathetic to me to still enjoy watching it.
I would like piggybacking off of that, because, like, I agree with you, and I do think, historically, referentially, the real Roy Cohn obviously is this huge bastard, and nobody should ever, think, oh, wow, the play redeemed him, and I don't think the play is even trying to redeem him, per se. But the arc that he goes through in the play, especially part 2, is interesting, because he's introduced in part 2 getting upset that he has a black nurse and requesting a white one. Like, that is the first thing we see of him in this play. And, he uses all kinds of slurs that I will not repeat here, in reference to Belize throughout. And yeah, there is that kind of great moment where he tries and succeeds to get Belize to snap in the same way and retaliate. But the scene in reference to this question that really kind of stands out to me is the kind of mourner's cottage scene, because the debate that I think, at least that this question is sort of trying to, get at and cut to the core of, is in very short form had in that scene, because Lewis shows up as like, that's, Roy Cohn, to hell with him, awful human being, I will not bless him. And Belize says, and I wrote down the quote exactly, quote, he was a terrible person, he died a hard death, maybe a queen can forgive her vanquished foe. And then Ethel Rosenberg continues the Kaddish, the person who has probably more reason than anyone to hate him. And she gives it her own flair by ending it with a son of a bitch, but
she still said the prayer.
Says it, and honestly, every time I watch or read the play, I get a little misty in the eyes at that moment, because that is beautiful. But it's Roy Cohn. And I don't know what Kushner wants to leave us with, because I do think that in the spirit of forgiveness, there is something to be said about moving forward and not hating thy enemy, turn the other cheek, a very religious idea. But at the same time, I kind of worry, sort of from a reception theory perspective, of people leaving this play thinking, that we are rehabilitating him historically, in a sense. Kel, do you want to jump onto this?
So in the first part, when Lewis is speaking to his rabbi, saying is there forgiveness for someone who leaves somebody in their greatest hour of need? And his rabbi goes you want forgiveness, go see a priest. I like that those two elements bookend these two parts.
Well, and that's the thing, because the rabbi says, Catholics believe in forgiveness, Jews believe in guilt, and I think it's very interesting through a Jewish prayer of mourning spoken by Ethel Rosenberg and Lewis, the two sort of Jewish characters, flagship figures we have in here. I think Kushner is trying to say to us that it's kind of the end of the Oresteia, that we need to end this cycle of kind of vengeance and hatred and retribution, because it won't get us anywhere, and we, it's just stalling us from the actual goals of peace and unity.
I slightly disagree, I think, maybe, about Roy, and whether, I don't think his death redeems him, but I do think that Kushner offers us very complicated ways to attempt to sympathize with him. And I think Kushner is interested in all of the characters' irresolvable contradictions. I mean, Lewis is what a disaster that guy is, and yet he's also lovable in some weird way too. Even though he's like the rabbi says, who would do what kind of person would do such a thing? And then he goes and does it. There's a story. I got lots of anecdotes, but there's a story about that Oscar Eustis tells of going to see the first showing of the AIDS quilt with Kushner, and there's a panel. There's a panel for Roy Cohn, and it says Roy Cohn, bully, coward, victim. And Tony, Oscar Eustis says, Tony looked at it and said, if I can write something half as dialectical as that, it'll be a great character. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that we see that he's such a loathsome figure in real life and in the play, but we get pointed towards his suffering and therefore his humanity. And so, we have the scene, all those many scenes between him and Belize, and him pushing Belize, like you were mentioning, but also the scene where Belize decides to give him this tip about don't get radiation and if you can pull any strings, get your hands on a stash of AZT. Don't go for don't do the trial version, get your own stash, which is what Roy ends up doing. And that's going to take us to our next question in a second, but about the AZT. But I think that we find so many instances where people in this play make common cause with each other, or they find common ground somehow, right? I mean, we already talked a lot about the Hannah Pitt Pryor scene, but also we get it with Harper and Pryor. We get it with even Lewis and Belize, who are kind of at each other's throats in a certain way, but Lewis becomes the one person that redeems the act of stealing the AZT, and Belize needs him. And then of course we see them all together at the end. So somehow they're able to transcend these differences. They preserve them, but they transcend them. So I think Roy is part of that really complicated fabric, yeah.
Quilt, so to speak.
The quilt.
Another thought that does just occur to me, like concerning Roy, is the last time we see him, or at least see him as Roy, isn't his death scene, but it is the scene with Joe. Mm-hmm. And again, we kind of debated earlier whose fantasy is this? Is this Joe imagining Roy? Is this the actual ghost of Roy visiting Joe? But that's a very positive moment that we leave this character on. Is if we ended in the hospital with the Kaddish, especially with I want to be an octopus, which kind of takes us right back to his first line in the play, and very much he's still Roy, especially right after the fake out. If we had ended there, I would kind of see it as, yes, there is this complicated humanizing of the character who we recognize as a bad person, who still maybe deserves forgiveness. But at least if we had ended on the fake out, I think Kushner is still saying us that Roy hasn't changed, but we can change how we look at him. Yeah. But then the ghost scene comes, and I'm like, if we are to read this as the actual ghost of Roy, because Joe doesn't realize that Roy's dead at that point. Mm-hmm. So if it is just his internal fantasy, it's a strange one for him to kind of come to on his own. At least, if we think of a sort of Freudian Jungian view of psychology, where these are all things that he's sort of bringing with him, from his own experiences. And yeah, I feel like having that immediately follow the Mourner's Kaddish, maybe we can read it as this blessing allows him to sort of lose some of the baggage of who he was as a person and become this sort of like angelic spirit, finally freed from life, freed from being a lawyer. The one thing he hung on to tooth and claw harder than anything no longer applies. That he could finally have this like genuine moment of humanity with the person he, I think, at least loves to a certain extent.
Self-hate
Yeah,
he's filled with. Yeah, I mean, actually, a lot of our notes are similar to each other in this answer. So first off, Roy's death does not redeem him. Kushner ensures that by mocking the traditional cinematic death scene of Ethel singing over the dead body of Roy, or at least what we think is the dead body of Roy, only to have Nathan Lane do his perfect comedic, "Ha-ha! I got you!"
finally got you to sing.
Exactly.
It's such a Richard III moment.
It is. It totally is. And the fact that Kushner chooses to have Roy's final line, at least in his mortal form, as "I want to come back as an octopus," which was almost a question that Ryan and I put on this thing was, what does that final line mean? But we felt the death scene in general just opened up the question there. But I mean, I think Kushner is, because he realizing who Roy Cohn was, I think that is Kushner's way of really making sure we don't fully sympathize or empathize with this man whose lessons we're still feeling the ramifications of today, because a lot of people forget who Roy Cohn mentored. And that was Roger Stone and Donald Trump were his two big modern day mentors. So a lot of his tactics are still being executed now in our current world. So, I mean, Roy Cohn is a very complex man, and I think what this play brought to me was, once again, something my dad and I will debate each other all the time, but he always reminds me of, Mac, go for the middle. Read, study, go for both sides, get the full picture. Don't just go one side or the other side, because then you lose your full perspective. And I think what Kushner does, even though Roy is a horrible man who basically got Ethel killed or executed, he was a man whose father, as Autumn pointed out in the last episode, was a Democrat. So it wasn't like he came from a long line of Republicans. Like, Roy
the Democratic Party also went through a lot of change during this very important historical juncture, but
they did. But it's the whole point of Roy is a man full of self-hatred for him as a Jewish person, as well as for him as a gay man. There's a lot of self-hate and loathing, and the fact that he sets out his entire life goes basically ripping down everything that reminds him of himself, or at least the reflections of himself that he's able to. That's his life's goal, is just let me rip everything apart that ever symbolizes my past in basically what makes up the fabric of me. And Kushner brought that to this character, where Roy is an incredibly complex character. I mean, the fact that one of my favorite scenes of both parts is Roy in the doctor's office doing, "I am not gay, I am Roy Cohn." People
I am a heterosexual man who happens to sleep with men.
Right? But it's the thing of, and the fact that he acknowledges the political world full on just embraces that element. Now, mind you, Roy Cohn was kind of like J. Edgar Hoover there, who had a lot of dirt on a lot of people, so they knew not to go after him, because he even had stuff on J. Edgar Hoover, hence why J. Edgar Hoover never went after Roy Cohn, even though he had a lot of mob ties. Hence why he was able to get Donald Trump all that cement back in the day. So either way, but Roy Cohn, incredibly complex, and I think, and I don't think Kushner ever meant for us to sympathize. I think what Kushner was wanting us to do is to just acknowledge the complex nature of humans in general. Like, Lewis is racist, but he also identifies as a Democrat. Belitz also says some very anti-Semitic things, but yet he also does a lot of good things in the play. Joe has a big religion versus sexuality journey here that he goes through. Hannah starts the play very much in the classical right-wing religious ideology, and by the end she is a changed person, and I think that's what Kushner was wanting in this, and it's a lot of stuff we got into in the last part as well, which is this play doesn't favor one side or the other in the argument of who is bad. Kushner points out that everybody's got shit in their closet. Everybody's got that damn dirty dark side to them. Nobody is a totally pure, all good saint of a person. Everybody's got blood on their hands. And I think that's what
I feel like the consensus, I think, of everything we brought up is just the play wants us to forgive but not forget.
I wouldn't even say forgive Roy Cohn. I don't think this play wants you to forgive Roy Cohn. I think this play just wants you to identify Roy Cohn as a human who had his flaws. Doesn't excuse what he did. You never forgive what Roy Cohn did, because he did some horrible, awful things in the world. Never. I know I couldn't forgive him for that. But what I can do is I can appreciate the complexity of him as a human being. Same thing with a lot of people like George W. Bush right now is going through a big cultural shift that people are going through. Like, back when he left office, he was a very hated person, but now he's kind of chummy with Michelle Obama, and they got a really cute social media relationship there that people seem to, like, overlook a lot of some of the shit that he did. And it's the thing of George W. Bush being a very kind of centrist person compared to somebody like a Donald Trump. And it's the thing of George W. Bush is a very complex figure. Like, he is not someone who you just go, he was a bad person. There's a lot going on there. He himself had a lot of turmoil and redemption with alcohol and in his younger years, and his struggles with that, and the way he kind of came through that for his family and things like that. He's a very complex person. I would love to see a play exploring the world of George W.
Like, we already have a perfectly fine Oliver Stone movie about it.
I think there's more there, and I think we'll get more. And I'll be very interested to see historically what happens with Donald Trump as a figure that people will write and explore. Because I feel there's a lot we haven't unearthed about him yet that maybe will give us a more complex picture of who these people are. Because, I mean, everybody is complex. Nobody is all one thing or the other. We are all made up of different elements and different pieces that make us into this Frankenstein of a human that we all are.
In contrast to Roy, I think the character who gets redeemed the least is actually Joe, because the last moments we have with it, well, we have the great have you no decency scene with Lewis, and then right before Harper's leaving and asking for the credit card and saying no, she's not gonna call, like that really puts into light how much paternalism Joe had towards Harper that really just held her back. And I think that you end seeing even Lewis still with Belize and Pryor and Hannah, but you don't get to see Joe surrounded by anybody else at the end of things. Yeah. So I think if there's one person that doesn't get forgiven, it's Joe.
Well, that's interesting because obviously Joe Pitt isn't a real person the way Roy Cohn is, but their actions wise, if we're talking historically, what he has done in this play or what someone in the real world has done is now being attributed to in the have you no decency scene. Joe and Roy are very similar in terms of their impact on the world and the harm they've done to the LGBTQ community. Maybe Roy a little more so because he's been at it longer. But what I think is kind of the interesting contrast between these two characters is that Roy, who kind of gets a quasi-forgiveness here, never quite comes to terms with who he is and continues to sort of play his language games and never really changes who he is in this regard. Joe, who does have his sexual awakening and kind of really does get to kind of come to terms with sort of coming out story that in 99% of plays about people, queer people, that would be the success story. He doesn't get rehabilitated this way because it's almost like after everything you've learned about yourself, that you're finally pushing away this repression of your upbringing and your life. to this point, how do you not feel terrible about what you've done? And he says, like, I wrote down, like, the line that he says in the Have You No Decency scene. It's like, it's law, not justice. It's power. It's not the merits of the exercise. It's an expression of the ideal. And he doesn't. Yeah, and that's enough for him, just sticking to the letter of the law. Like, he doesn't kind of have this change, but neither does Roy. Yeah. So, like, I don't know why Roy is maybe dramaturgically more worthy of this forgiveness that he's given than Joe is. I don't know. They're both complicated, I guess. Long way of saying that.
Well, let's get into a really complicated ethical question here, which is it right/ethical/justified for police to steal Roy's AZT pills? Brian, as a fan of The Good Place like me, which is all full of moral, ethical quandaries, where do you stand on this argument?
Like, so, first of all, Roy only has the pills because of Belize. I think is worth addressing. That he didn't even know that this is like a drug he needed. He probably would have just gone for the radiation and died a lot sooner. And Belize also gives him the tip that, you don't want to be on the trial. You use your kind of clout that you love to talk about to get you what you need. And he uses that tip, Roy uses that tip to become the dragon hoarding the gold. Yeah. And Belize says kind of at the very beginning of seeing that stash that you could live another 50 years and not use all of this. Yeah. So, like, if we need a metaphor for the destructive influence of capitalism, it's that. It is, the wealthy, politically connected person having more of the thing they need while others suffer out of a lack of it. And, being the dirty commie that I am not personally against, Belize redistributing that wealth to the people who need it. And especially, it would be a little different, not a big different, if Roy was still alive when this ransacking happens. Because, not that, like, they could still take, all of the excess, leave Roy with what he needs, and still, I would still be okay with that, because Roy doesn't need it. But especially after Roy is gone, for it to just be returned to the FDA or the system or wherever it would wind up going. And, we know, certainly historically, but they knew it well enough in the present, of how the Reagan administration was mismanaging this crisis and not getting these meds to the people who need it. I am completely on board with this vigilantism, Robin Hood-esque, so to speak, of, and, to go back to that line of Joe's that I just quoted, it's not law, it's justice. Well, this, or it's the law, it's not justice, is what Joe says. Well, this is justice, not the law. It's not what, the letter of the law says they should do, but it is what is needed at this time. And, Pryor, 5 years later, is still alive, living with AIDS, and therein, within that epilogue, is contained the reason why it was worth it. And I'm curious to see if anyone objects to this reasoning, because I feel like it's pretty sound to me.
No, I was pro-theft. More crime.
More crime.
Kel approves.
I think there's this great documentary about Kushner called Wrestling with Angels, and in it there's he's doing some kind of student talk back, and a student asks him about there's some kind of like critique of the sense of hope in some of his plays, and so she asked him to respond to that, and he says it's an ethical obligation to look for hope. It's an ethical obligation not to despair. There's always the possibility of finding a place where action can change the course of things. So I think Billy's stealing the AZT points us to this ethical obligation to hope, right? That in spite of every shred of evidence, Pryor will live, right? Like you were just pointing out, Ryan, that there he is 5 years on living with AIDS, which was something people were only hoping for at the time, and which is now completely a reality. People living with HIV being undetectable in their systems. So I think that so I think that's part of it. Also, Kushner writes in the notes at the beginning of Millennium that the play is a comedy. It's a comedy. Pryor has to live, and we have to find a way structurally for that to happen, right? So I think, he's got to figure that out. Kushner has to figure that out dramaturgically. But as we learn more about the interconnectedness of the characters, Roy's notion of the pecking order, this kind of vertical hierarchy, gets disrupted in these weaving, looping connections between people. And if we kind of follow the prop, right? If we play that game, the AZT is kind of staging that idea, right? So he has to, Belize has to steal the pills. He has to steal them thematically, comedically, and structurally for the play to work, right?
Yeah. So I broke it down into each of these categories of right, ethical, justified, because I couldn't just summarize it all into one thing, because I was full of conflicts and contradictions here.
That's why we put all those slashes in the question.
I know. You put that in there on purpose.
Yeah, there was no one word that satisfied you.
Yes. So, first of all, on the question of is it right? So Belize is right to steal the pills. Because as someone who actually is part of this community, who knows what's happening to his friends who are dying horrible, horrible deaths, and knowing because he works as a nurse, the mismanagement of the system, and he knows what happens if those pills get back in there, he has absolutely right to take the pills, because if anyone's going to distribute them well, there's going to be someone who actually knows the system and knows who needs them. And also the fact that there are probably a lot of friends who could not afford the pills, because unlike here in our Canadian healthcare system where this type of thing will be covered, down stateside you would have to pay an arm and a leg to get something like this. So there were a lot of people who just couldn't afford simply to get the pills because they just don't have that financial ability to do it. So the fact that you have someone like Belize who is, I think it was you who said he was acting like a Robin Hood, and I was like, yep, that's a very good way of looking at it. Then we get to the ethical side of the thing. And I had to go with no. Ethically speaking, no, Belize is not right to steal. And I equate this as similar to Jean Valjean stealing the loaf of bread to save his starving sister and nephew. Where it's, stealing is stealing. Stealing is wrong no matter which way you go about it. It's against the law. We may not like the law, we don't like the system that's in place, but the rules and systems are there. So ethically, it's...
Before you move on to justified, I want to hear what Kel has to say.
Yes.
I'm just going to say he's dead, so is it grave robbing?
Which is still stealing, it's still property of somebody else. It was not given to Belize. It's still technically Roy's property, or now, I don't know, I guess it's property of the state. I don't know, but
he's not punished. He's not punished in the play, though. Like, if we talk about the world of the play...
Yeah. Oh, no, he's not punished. No.
Yeah, because nobody ever finds out that he stole. He waits before they've done their prayer and their ransacking before he calls the nurse.
Exactly. Nobody knows. I'm just looking at the bigger ethical question of...
is stealing wrong unilaterally?
Yeah. But yes, ethically, I'm a bit more on the no side of Belize. Justified, however... Belize's actions are certainly justified. Because as I said, Belize has seen friends die the horrible death. They know what happens to the pills. They know what's needed for the survival of somebody with AIDS is these pills. This is basically the one thing that can get you through. So justified, yes. I would like to see, though, as a footnote to all this, I would love to see a part 3 of Angels in America focused on Belize having to distribute the pills. Because it's a limited stock. So the minute now Belize has to be the dispenser of this life-saving medicine, now you're going to even bigger moral quandaries of which friends do you say yes to, which friends do you say no to, which friends do you mark for death, and which friends do you let live? Because we know Pryor lives 5 years on. But how many more friends did Belize have to either keep secret that he had this stash, because it is a limited stash, and how many people was he able to save? So I do, as a fun footnote of, Kushner, if you want to write part 3, I think there's a really interesting plot you can get into there.
The thing that I would chip into that, though, is that we don't know if what Pryor's living on 5 years later is Roy Cohn's original medicine, or if it just got him far enough to when things actually got distributed through proper channels. So it's kind of like a minor detail, but that might
Kushner answered in part 3.
Yeah.
Or get down in the comments. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, overall, it's a very mixed question. I mean, 2/3 of me is yes. Bleats, you were right and you were justified to take the pills. The 1/3 that is working against me is the ethical quality of stealing something.
The law is all we have.
Right? Well, once again, what's one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not steal. Growing up as a kid,
but most of the other 10 commandments are all about how you should have no other gods and just really worship me,
right?
Your god the hardest. Like, they're dumb laws. Like,
they are absolutely dumb laws. I do not disagree there that they are a contradictory set of 10 commandments. I just go, growing up, that was always something that was drilled into me as a child is don't steal. So the fact that Bleats is clearly breaking the law and some nurse's ethical code of stealing from patients or grave robbing patients, there is a problem with that. No matter how justified or right the choice is, there is still an element of we're in some charcoal gray areas, as my mother would say. So there we go. All right. Well, we have made it through part 1 and part 2 of Angels in America. If you have stuck with us for both parts, congratulations. Thank you for doing so. But before we go, let's get some social plugs in there. So, Kel, you can go first. Where can people find and follow you?
I am kel-mcdonald.ca. That's it. I don't have anything else.
Love it. We'll check that out. Dana, where can people find and follow you?
You can't. I don't exist.
Ryan.
Cool.
Speaking of Ryan, give us your classic Ryan Borochovitz send-off.
Yeah, I also usually just have a very blunt "you can't." The only social media I'm on is Facebook, and I don't really want friend requests from strangers, so no thank you.
You do have Twitter, don't you, Ryan?
I made a Twitter account like a million years ago that I have not tweeted on or even logged into once since then. So yeah, let's everyone go follow that. Let's see if I can get a fan base in this thing I never used. But no, just send all that love to Cup of Hemlock Theatre. That's what you're watching right now. It's on the mug, and COH Theatre on all platforms.
You can find and follow me at Mackenzie Horner. You can follow the Cup of Hemlock podcast at Cup of Hemlock Podcast, where you can catch up on all our older episodes as well as these new current episodes. You can take us on the go there. Lots of great stuff. You can hear the really funny ad Ryan and I did for Anchor Podcast. It's a hoot. You also can follow my other podcast all about musicals at Before the Downbeat, a musical podcast. So check that out too. Other than that, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in. Oh wait, before we go though, Ryan, should we plug the sonnets?
There's a link in the description. Sign up for a sonnet, and you too can be featured here. Shakespeare sonnets.
Love it. All right, everybody. Other than that, we will let you go. Enjoy your day, your weekend, wherever you're listening. Stay healthy, stay safe. We will see you all next time on The Cup. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.